Settle in now. Let your shoulders ease down. Let your breath slow, your gaze soften. Tonight, you'll be traveling not through dreams just yet, but through a quieter corridor of history. You won't be asked to rush. You won't need to remember names or dates. You're simply here to drift through the distant past, carried by soft words and gentle details. Imagine for a moment that you're in a village, not a city, not a castle, but a little village somewhere in early modern Europe. Perhaps it is the early 1600s, or a little later, or earlier still. The air smells of wood smoke and damp straw. Life is modest and mostly uneventful. Chickens scratch in muddy yards, and hearth fires are rarely allowed to go out. Most people are poor, most live close to the land, and few travel farther than the market town a day's walk away. And yet, something unspoken always simmers just beneath the surface of this small, simple world. Something tense and taut like a wire strung too tight. It's fear. Fear of the unseen, the unexplained. Fear of illness, of crop failure, of children wasting away in their sleep. And fear, above all, of a neighbor who might not be who she seems. Someone who perhaps knows too much about herbs, or whose goat always seems to give milk when others do not. Someone who doesn't quite fit. Someone who might be a witch. Tonight, you'll explore that very fear, not the spectacle of it, not the flames and the shouting, but the quiet, creeping dread that could settle over an innocent person's life, slowly, like morning fog, until all they once knew disappeared into darkness. Let's begin with the world these people lived in. The ordinary world, the world from which accusations rose like smoke from a peat fire thin at first, but thickening until all air seemed choked with suspicion. Before a person could be called a witch, they were simply a person, perhaps a widow, perhaps a midwife, or perhaps just a woman who spoke her mind too often. But whoever they were, their daily lives followed predictable, steady rhythms, shaped more by the seasons than the hours. You might imagine her in the early light of a cold spring morning. She rises before the sun, the chill of the night still clinging to the stone walls of her modest cottage. The hearth is cold, and she moves methodically to rekindle it with kindling laid the night before. The fire coughs to life slowly, orange embers brightening into a steady glow. A kettle is hung, and soon the scent of boiling water blends with the musk of dried herbs hanging from the beams. Life in these rural villages was hard, but not without its simple routines. Water had to be fetched, firewood chopped, bread baked. Meals were plain and small barley, leeks, onions, and the occasional bit of fish or salted pork. Each action had a purpose, and in such a tightly wound existence, even small oddities could feel immense. It might be that she has knowledge of herbs passed down from her mother. Perhaps she knows that yarrow staunches blood, that feverfew brings down a temperature, and so neighbours call on her when illness comes. They bring her their sick children, their labouring wives, their fevers and headaches. She tends them, not out of sorcery, but out of tradition. But quietly, a murmur begins. She knows too much. She cures what others cannot. Still, life goes on. Days blur together in the way of pre-industrial time. Market days break the monotony. Candles are made by hand. Cloth is mended by firelight. And always the church bells ring, marking hours, days, and holy days alike. For religion is not just belief, but structure. It defines who belongs and who doesn't. And here is where unease can grow. For if she skips a service, or fails to cross herself at the right moment, or mutters prayers in a tongue too old to be Latin, people take notice. Their faces remain polite, but their eyes begin to hold something colder. Cattle die sometimes, milk spoils, bread does not rise. And when these things happen, people want answers. Not scientific ones. They do not yet have those, but spiritual ones, supernatural ones. A child falls sick without warning. A storm hits after months of clear skies. The soil refuses to yield crops, and the village starts to whisper. In the world of superstition, Coincidence is a luxury no one can afford. Someone must be to blame. She feels it first, not in words, but in space. The way people start to leave wider gaps around her in the lane. The way greetings become shorter, more brittle. Children look at her, and then away, as if told not to linger. There is no proof, only presents her presence, increasingly seen as threatening. And yet, on the surface, her life remains the same. She rises early, gathers herbs, tends the fire, feeds the hens. But the air has changed. Where once there was quiet, now there is silence. A silence too perfect, like a forest before the thunder breaks. Perhaps she doesn't know she's being watched, or perhaps she does, and chooses to ignore it. It wouldn't help to protest. The more loudly you deny, the more suspicious you seem. So she continues as always, though her world is already shifting beneath her. This was the beginning of the nightmare, not the trial, not the punishment, but this slow unraveling of daily life. To live under a gathering cloud, knowing something is coming, but not knowing when, or from whom, or why. Now that you've seen how the seeds of accusation were planted in the soil of ordinary life, let us walk further down this shadowed path. The next step is the accusation itself and how quickly the mundane can turn monstrous. There is rarely a dramatic moment, no fanfare, no shouted declaration. More often, the accusation creeps in quietly, perhaps as a murmur during a church gathering, or a veiled comment offered to a local magistrate. Perhaps a child points and says something strange, or a neighbor casually remarks that misfortune follows the woman. Sometimes it is sparked by something as trivial as a failed harvest or a sudden fever. A scapegoat is needed, and often that scapegoat is already halfway chosen. You must remember too that in these tightly bound communities, reputations are fragile and enduring. If someone is known to be strange or solitary, it takes little to tip the balance. A glance held too long, a phrase spoken in haste, an animal dying under unusual circumstances. The evidence need not be convincing. It only needs to fit the unease people already feel. The first real sign often comes in the form of a summons, a thin parchment sealed in wax, bearing the name of the accused and the expectation of her appearance before a local tribunal. Or perhaps she is simply taken without warning, without ceremony, escorted by two quiet men, their expressions unreadable. In some villages there is no need for formal paperwork. A small gathering of elders, or a lone inquisitor appointed by the crown or church, may suffice. The legal system, if one can call it that, is inconsistent. Depending on the time and place, the accused may be brought to a manor house, a town hall, or even a makeshift room above a tavern, hastily converted into a courtroom. There is little chance to prepare, no lawyer, no warning of the charges to be brought. She might not even know who has spoken against her. It could be someone she once helped, someone she thought a friend, or someone she has never spoken to at all. When she stands before her accusers, she is already guilty in the eyes of many, and her trial, if it can be called that, is not about proving innocence. It is about demonstrating guilt. The questions begin, soft at first. Has she spoken with spirits? Has she danced in the forest at night? Have strange animals followed her home? Have neighbors seen lights around her cottage? Has she read from books not approved by the church? The questions are not intended to find truth. They are designed to confuse, to corner. Many are impossible to answer cleanly. Denial is taken as proof of deception. A pause before answering is interpreted as concealment. Even silence is suspicious. Witnesses are called. Some bring stories of odd behavior of fire that wouldn't light, a cow that died suddenly, a child who cried at the sight of her. Others repeat rumors. Hearsay becomes testimony. Imagination becomes evidence. If the accused has a mark upon her skin, an old scar, a mole, a birthmark, it may be declared a witch's teat, a spot used to suckle demons. These marks are catalogued carefully. They are probed with needles to test for insensitivity. As it is said, witches feel no pain in those places. Should she falter under questioning, if her voice quivers, if she hesitates, it is considered telling. But if she remains composed, too calm, too firm, that too is suspicious. No response is safe. There is no correct way to behave. She is caught in a net where every movement tightens the cords. Sometimes, if the court is uncertain, they resort to ordeals. In one region, she may be bound and lowered into water. If she floats, she is guilty, for water rejects the unholy. If she sinks, she is innocent, though many never surface in time to receive that vindication. Elsewhere, she might be asked to recite prayers without error, a single stumbly missed word, a trembling voices taken as the devil's interference. She may be asked to touch a child who has fallen ill. If the child reacts, screams, convulses, even flinches, it is deemed proof. And if she confesses, well, then the story ends more quickly, though not more gently. But confessions, too, are complicated. Often, they are not offered freely, but coaxed through sleep deprivation, isolation, starvation, or worse. In such states, the line between reality and hallucination blurs. A woman may say anything if it means a moment's peace. But should she refuse? Should she hold firm to her innocence? Then the process draws out. Day after day, more questions, more stares, more silence, until she begins to doubt herself, her memory, her mind, her very name. And in all this, there is rarely uproar, no great cries of protest, because the village watches and waits and fears. They too are trying to stay invisible, to avoid notice, to ensure that they are never next. This is what made an accusation of witchcraft so terrifying. Not just the threat of punishment, but the collapse of everything familiar, the loss of identity, of safety, of community. To be accused was to be unmade. And yet, even this is only the middle of the ordeal. Once guilt was presumed or confessed, another chapter began: the rituals of punishment, the symbols, the solemn cruelty masked as justice. In the next segment, we'll step further into the machinery of consequence, the prisons, the trials, and the fate that awaited those branded as witches. After the accusation, and often after a confession coaxed through relentless questioning or sheer exhaustion, the machinery of punishment began its slow, deliberate turning. If you were among those accused, your name already etched into village rumor and official records alike, you would now find yourself held not in a place of safety, but in a liminal space between innocence and guilt, between life and the slow erosion of it. Prisons in early modern Europe were not spaces of long-term confinement like the ones you might imagine today. They were temporary, transitional, a place to store bodies, awaiting verdict or execution. Most were damp, windowless cells built below ground, or within the cold stone walls of city towers. They smelled of mildew and old straw, thick with the scent of human breath and waste. A small hole in the floor might serve as a drain, but more often, the filth simply accumulated. You would likely be alone, but sometimes several accused women were placed together. Some cried quietly, others stared blankly into the dark, having exhausted their emotions in the courtroom. The jailer might bring bread and water once or twice a day, but he would not speak to you unless he had to. You had become untouchable. And outside, the village shifted its eyes. People spoke your name in lowered tones. Children asked questions that their mothers did not answer. Even those who once came to you for healing or advice would now walk another way. Your very presence had become a contamination. Trials varied widely across Europe, shaped by local law, religious doctrine, and the temperament of those in power. In some cases, especially in Catholic territories, ecclesiastical courts oversaw the proceedings. In others, it was civil magistrates. Some followed detailed legal procedures, while others resembled more of a ritual than a rational process. Often the trial was more a formality than a genuine weighing of guilt. Testimonies had already been collected. Confessions had often been extracted. The accused was now expected to sit or stand and endure the final performance. Officials would read from documents, perhaps scribbled hastily by candlelight during interrogations. Witnesses would repeat their tales, and if a confession had been given, it would be read aloud whether it was accurate or not. There was something deeply theatrical about it all. The robes of the magistrate, the hush of the assembled villagers, the intonation of prayers and oaths, and at the centre, the accused, often weak from hunger and sleeplessness, sometimes chained, always watched. The charges were not merely about spells or curses. They were philosophical, spiritual, and existential. The accused had supposedly turned away from God, made pacts with the devil, consorted with spirits, corrupted the innocent. These were crimes not only of action but of intention deep, invisible treacheries that could never truly be disproved. When verdicts came, they were often delivered with grave solemnity. There was rarely shouting or outcry, just a quiet finality, a nod, a signature, a sentence. And with that, the punishment would be set into motion. In some places, death was considered too merciful for a witch. Humiliation came first. You might be paraded through town, bound and barefoot, wearing a sackcloth robe. Townspeople would line the streets, not always jeering, sometimes just staring. Children clung to their mothers. The smell of ash and wet stone clung to the air. Execution, when it came, was not always by fire, as is commonly imagined. In many Protestant regions, hanging was more typical. In Catholic territories, and in larger witch hunts like those in Germany or parts of France, burning was seen not merely as a punishment, but a purification. But this, too, was carried out with ritual. You might be walked to the stake slowly, your hands tied behind you. A priest might walk beside you, offering you last rites, urging you to repent whether you believed in your guilt or not. The wood would already be arranged, the rope waiting. The crowd would gather, not in celebration but in fear. Watching was a kind of participation. It reminded everyone what happened to those who stood out. In some cases, if you were lucky or if your family could pay, a pouch of powder might be tied at your neck, meant to render you unconscious before the flames rose too high. In others, death came more slowly. And yet, it is important to say, not all accused witches were executed. Some were imprisoned for years. Some were released. Some survived only to find their homes burned, their names ruined, their futures stripped away. The damage lingered, even when the body remained. The real punishment of a witch trial was not only the sentence, but the erasure. To be accused was to be taken apart, piece by piece, your role in the community, your relationships, your faith, your name. And by the time it ended, there was often little left to reclaim. But how did these events come to be in the first place? Why did societies otherwise bound by religion, custom, and neighbourly turn so viciously against their own? In the next segment, we'll explore the deep roots of witchcraft belief, the fears, the superstitions, and the stories that gave rise to an entire system of suspicion and suffering. To truly understand how such a nightmare could unfold, not just once, but thousands of times across centuries, you must gently trace the thread backward. Long before any trials, long before courtrooms or confessions, there existed stories, quiet tales, whispered around hearths and exchanged on winter nights, in the dim stillness when daylight had fled and firelight danced against the walls. In many cultures across Europe, the idea of witchcraft existed long before the Church defined it as heresy. These early notions were steeped not in doctrine, but in folklore. People believed the world was full of invisible forces and benevolent, others not. Forests, lakes, and even lonely crossroads were thought to be inhabited by spirits. The line between nature and the supernatural was not a border but a fog, shifting constantly. The witch in these older stories was often a figure of ambiguity, sometimes feared, but sometimes respected. A healer, a wise woman, someone who knew the rhythms of the land, the properties of plants, the behavior of animals. She lived close to nature, outside the rigid structures of village life. And because of this, she occupied a space both mystical and marginal. As Christianity spread across Europe, these folk beliefs did not vanish. They merged, transformed, and were reinterpreted through a new lens. Church authorities, concerned with order and orthodoxy, began to see such figures not as healers or oddities, but as threats evidence of lingering paganism, of deviation from divine authority. And over time, the word witch ceased to describe someone curious or capable. It became a label for danger, for betrayal, for a servant of darkness. The turning point came in the late Middle Ages, particularly after the publication of texts like the Malleus Maleficarum in the late 15th century. This book, whose title means the Hammer of Witches, was not folklore, but instruction. Written by inquisitors, it detailed how to identify, interrogate, and prosecute witches. It claimed, without doubt, that witches were real, that they worked with demons, and that they posed an existential threat to Christian society. Such works gave shape to the fears that already existed. They transformed vague suspicions into structured accusations. They listed signs to watch for: familiar spirits, strange dreams, sudden illness, broken crops, spoiled milk. And they made it clear that no community was safe while witches remained within it. The idea that someone could cause harm with a mere glance, a spoken word, or a secret ritual fed deeply into rural imaginations. When life is fragile, when a season's harvest can mean life or death, when disease strikes without warning, when childbirth is perilous and unpredictable people search for meaning, and sometimes meaning comes easiest through blame. The weather turns harsh, perhaps someone called it down, a child is born sickly, perhaps the midwife invited misfortune, a marriage falls apart, perhaps a rival hexed it. In this way, suspicion became a framework for understanding misfortune, and the witch became the perfect vessel for all that could not be controlled. Witchcraft beliefs also intersected with power, social, religious, and gendered. Women were the overwhelming majority of the accused, particularly those who lived outside traditional roles: unmarried, childless, poor, outspoken, or too knowledgeable. In a world where conformity brought safety, independence was risky. Men were accused too, though less often, and in certain waves such as in the German witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, entire communities were consumed by accusations. Neighbours turned on neighbours. Entire families vanished into prisons and ash. At times, the fear rose not from the people but from above. Authorities, seeking to assert control or moral reform, launched campaigns to root out heresy. Other times it began with the whispers of villagers, which grew into roars too loud to ignore. No single cause can explain it all. It was a tangle of fear, belief, politics, and grief. And once the idea of witches became institutionalized, once it had rules, categories, legal definitions, it became nearly impossible to escape. The more people believed, the more evidence they found. The more evidence they found, the more deeply the belief rooted itself. Still, not every region responded the same way. In some parts of Europe, skepticism took hold more quickly. Judges threw out cases. Priests spoke against the frenzy. But where fear was stronger than doubt, the fires burned longer. Witchcraft belief, then, was not a superstition in isolation. It was a reflection of everything people feared but could not see: death, failure, betrayal, the loss of control. It was a way of naming the chaos that lived just beyond the edges of the village path. And that is perhaps what made it so potent and so enduring. In the next segment, we will look closely at how gender played a role in shaping the witch image, why women, more than men, were seen as susceptible to temptation, more dangerous when deviant, and more likely to be believed guilty of the invisible. As you drift further into this quiet history, the question may form in your mind: why were so many of the accused women? Why was witchcraft so often a feminine crime? The answer lies not in any single cause, but in a long pattern woven from belief, law, and custom about what it meant to be a woman in early modern Europe, and what it meant, above all, to be a woman who did not conform. In most rural and urban societies of the time, women were expected to be modest, obedient, silent, and domestic. Their lives were closely tied to the household and to their relationships with menars, daughters, wives, or widows. Their access to education was limited. Their property rights were constrained. Their voices, in most legal and ecclesiastical settings, were often considered unreliable or secondary. But even within these limits, women found ways to hold influence. Midwives, for instance, guided women through childbirth, one of life's most dangerous and mystical transitions. Herbalists knew the plants of the forest, the roots that soothed pain, the leaves that broke fevers. Older women often became caretakers of community memory and ritual, keepers of charms or weather lore passed down through generations. And in a society where so much was beyond understanding plague, miscarriage, famine such knowledge could both comfort and disturb. When all went well, the midwife was respected, the healer was valued, the widow was tolerated. But when fortunes turned, that same knowledge became dangerous. It was not just what these women did, it was that they acted. They advised. They carried power not granted by church or state, and power, in the hands of those without permission, is often feared. The image of the witch that developed across Europe was not uniform, but certain traits repeated again and again. She was often older past childbearing age, outside the reach of patriarchal reproduction. She might be poor, and therefore suspected of bitterness or envy. She might live alone, and therefore not under the watch of a husband. She might speak sharply, or claim to see things others could not. She might know too much, or say too little. She might simply be inconvenient. The legal texts of the time reflect these assumptions. Writers of witch-hunting manuals often described women as weaker in faith, more carnal, more prone to envy and gossip. The Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous guide, even states that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. Its authors viewed women not only as likely suspects, but as natural witches by virtue of their bodies and temperaments. Of course, many men were accused too, especially in places where fear spread like wildfire. But statistically, women bore the brunt. In Germany, Switzerland, and parts of France, the proportion of female victims often exceeded 80%. It wasn't always a matter of persecution from distant rulers. Often the finger was pointed by neighbors, sometimes by other women. Accusations might arise from conflicts over property, envy between households, or disputes over children. A young wife might accuse her mother-in-law. A family grieving a child might look for someone to blame. In small communities, old grievances ran deep, and witchcraft offered a framework to express them. And so gender, while not the only factor, shaped everything: the suspicion, the trial, the interpretation of behavior. A woman who argued could be described as shrill. A man who argued was merely assertive. A woman who wept was said to manipulate. A man who wept might be said to suffer nobly. These subtle biases wove themselves into every corner of the process, often unnoticed by those who lived within it. But even beyond the trials, the image of the witch lingered in cultural memory. In ballads, in woodcuts, in whispered stories passed down to children, she became a symbol of everything unruly, mysterious, and feared in womanhood. Not merely evil but disruptive, wild, uncontrolled. In this way, the persecution of witches was not only an expression of religious anxiety, it was also an enforcement of social order, of gender roles, hierarchies, and proper conduct. To accuse a woman of witchcraft was to place her outside the bounds of acceptable existence, and once outside, there was little hope of returning. Yet within this tragic history, there were moments of resilience too. Some women fought back with words, with appeals, with sheer endurance. Some communities protected their own, refusing to believe or participate. And in time, as rationalism grew and legal standards changed, the flames began to die down. In the next segment, We'll explore how different regions and cultures treated witchcraft differently, why some areas became hotbeds of accusation, while others resisted the panic, and how the landscape of Europe influenced belief. As you continue to drift gently through this tapestry of history, your mind might now turn toward a quieter question. Why did some places become engulfed in witchcraft panic, while others remained almost untouched? The answers lie not just in laws and beliefs, but in the soil itself, the forests and mountains, the distance between villages, the lines of communication, and the shifting currents of power. Across early modern Europe, witchcraft trials appeared like clusters of firelight on a dark map. Some regions glowed fiercely burning for decades, while others stayed dim and still, even when close by. This uneven geography of persecution speaks to how deeply culture, politics, and local conditions shaped the spread of fear. Take the German-speaking territories of the Holy Roman Empire, for instance. Here, between the 15th and 17th centuries, thousands of people were accused, imprisoned, and executed. No single authority ruled over these lands. Instead, power was scattered among dukes, prince-bishops, city councils, and local inquisitors. This fragmentation allowed for overlapping jurisdictions, conflicting laws, and a lack of centralized restraint. One village might burn a dozen suspected witches, while the next remained untouched, depending entirely on who held the reins of justice. And in these fragmented lands, accusations could ripple outward like cracks in ice. One trial might inspire another. A successful confession in one town could prompt officials in the next to investigate their own. Fear traveled along trade routes and through family ties, spreading stories faster than reason could catch them. In contrast, countries with stronger centralized governments such as Spain and Italy often saw fewer executions. While it may seem counterintuitive, the presence of powerful institutions like the Spanish Inquisition actually curtailed many of the more chaotic local trials. The Inquisition, for all its severity, maintained strict legal procedures. It often demanded written evidence, credible witnesses, and formal confessions. And, despite its grim reputation, it frequently dismissed witchcraft cases as the result of superstition rather than genuine heresy. England, too, experienced its own waves of accusation, but with notable regional differences. In East Anglia, for example, during the English Civil War, a man named Matthew Hopkins appointed himself the Witchfinder General and set off a brutal spree of trials. But in other areas of the country, such as the North and West, witch trials were rare. Local magistrates, more cautious or skeptical, may have refused to entertain charges based on little more than rumour. Scotland, on the other hand, saw proportionally higher numbers of accusations than its southern neighbour. This was due in part to the influence of Calvinist religious reform, which emphasised the presence of Satan in daily life and the need for moral purity. In Scotland, trials were often fast, and confessions once extracted were used to justify further arrests. Whole villages could be swept up in a matter of days. The Scandinavian countries, too, were not immune. In parts of Sweden and Finland, child testimonies played a prominent role. In one notable case in the 17th century, children claimed they had been taken by witches to a place called Blockula, a kind of demonic Sabbath. These tales, vivid and fantastical, led to a wave of executions. Even beyond Europe, witchcraft accusations flared in colonial outposts. The Salem witch trials in 1692, though small in number compared to European panics, remain among the most famous. In that fragile Puritan settlement, fear mixed with political instability, personal vendettas, and religious anxiety, creating a storm that would claim many lives. What's striking across these diverse places is how much context mattered. Witch trials were not inevitable, and belief alone did not spark them. Often they emerged at the intersection of social stress, weak legal structures, and local leaders willing or eager to pursue accusations. Where rulers were skeptical, trials rarely gained momentum. Where communities were stable and relatively prosperous, accusations had little fertile ground. But where famine had taken hold, where disease had lingered, or where religious conflict had frayed communal trust, the whisper of witchcraft found quick purchase. And yet, there were always limits. Even in the most fervent regions, the panic eventually exhausted itself. The same fragmentation that allowed fear to spread also allowed it to fade. Magistrates grew weary. Skeptics gained influence. A few brave voices began to question the methods and the motives. By the late 17th century, the tide was turning. Trials still occurred, but they grew fewer, more hesitant, and often ended without execution. In the next segment, we'll begin to explore the decline of the witch trial show. Skepticism slowly took root, how scientific and legal changes reshaped belief, and how societies began to look back at their own actions with uneasy reflection. As you lie still and let the soft contours of history settle around you, imagine a world slowly waking from a long, fevered dream. The panic did not end all at once. There was no single moment of reckoning, no loud proclamation that the age of witches had passed. Instead, it ebbed quietly, gradually over decades, like fog lifting from a field at dawn. By the late 1600s and into the early 1700s, the great age of witch hunting was faltering. In town after town, officials hesitated where once they had acted swiftly. Accusations were still made, but trials were shorter, more cautious. And executions once common and even expected became rare, then vanished altogether. What caused this slow change? It began, as many great shifts do, in thought. In the early modern period, Europe saw the rise of what would later be called the Enlightenment, broad and varied movement of scholars, philosophers, scientists, and jurists who began to challenge old assumptions. They questioned not just religion or monarchy, but the very frameworks of truth and evidence. Witchcraft, long accepted without question, became one of the first casualties of this new scrutiny. Legal thinkers began to argue that confessions obtained under torture were unreliable. They examined court records and noted how inconsistencies, vague testimony, and recycled accusations had led to deaths. Judges began to demand real proof that, of course, could never truly be produced for a crime built on invisibility and intention. In 1631, a Jesuit priest named Friedrich Spee published a quiet, anonymous book entitled Cortio Criminalis Precautions in Criminal Cases. In it, he described the injustice of witch trials and the madness of confession under torture. Spee had witnessed many such trials, and he wrote not as a distant scholar, but as a man haunted by what he had seen. His words circulated in secret but planted seeds. Elsewhere, the writings of people like Reginald Scott in England and Johann Weyer in the Low Countries began to pierce the veil of superstition. These men did not deny that evil existed, nor even that some people practiced harmful magic, but they argued that the wild scale of the trials and the uncritical belief in devilish conspiracies were dangerous and unjust. Alongside these intellectual shifts came changes in law. Courts began to place greater emphasis on procedure and precedent. Witnesses were cross-examined more carefully. Torture was increasingly limited or outlawed. In some cases, higher courts overturned local convictions, sending a message that not all accusations would be automatically upheld. Religion, too, played a paradoxical role in this decline. As Protestant and Catholic authorities stabilized after decades of Reformation and Counter-Reformation, they no longer needed witchcraft trials to demonstrate their moral strength. The idea of a unified enemy in the form of the witch lost its political and symbolic usefulness. But perhaps just as important were the people themselves. Villagers had grown weary of the fear. They had seen neighbors die, children testify against mothers, and entire families destroyed. In some communities, the memory of executions lingered like smoke in the bones of old houses. People began to speak of such things not with righteous satisfaction, but with unease. By the early 18th century, most of Europe had stopped executing witches altogether. Trials might still occur, especially in remote areas, but they rarely ended in death. Instead, accused individuals might be fined, banished, or publicly shamed. The final legal executions varied by country. In Switzerland, the last known execution occurred in 1782. A woman named Anna Goldie, charged more with scandal than sorcery, but tried under the old forms. In Poland, witch trials continued into the 1790s. In the New World, laws lingered on the books even longer, but by the close of the century, witchcraft as a criminal category had largely disappeared, and with it faded the intense fear that had gripped whole populations for generations. But witchcraft did not disappear entirely. It moved into new forms, into literature, into legend, into quiet corners of folklore where it could be remembered without danger. The image of the witch became a story, a symbol, a warning, no longer a sentence. Still, the silence that followed left a kind of absence. No apologies were made, no reparations offered. Those who had died were not honoured or remembered in official records. They had been erased, and for the most part, they remained so. In the next and final segment before our gentle conclusion, we will reflect on the legacy left behind, not just in books and beliefs, but in how societies remember, or forget, what fear can do when left unchecked. Now, as the night deepens and the past softens into shadow, we come to the final stretch of this quiet journey. We have traced the steps from suspicion to accusation, from trial to execution, from belief to disbelief. Yet long after the last fire was extinguished, the presence of witch trials continued to echo, subtle, persistent, and unresolved. The legacy of these centuries of fear is not only found in dusty court records or the faded bindings of old books. It is also found in the spaces left behind, fields where stakes once stood, churchyards where unnamed graves lie under lichen-covered stones, and in village memory passed from generation to generation, sometimes distorted, sometimes barely spoken aloud. In some regions, the names of the condemned were forgotten altogether. In others, they survived in whispers. The woman who lived on the hill, the one they said could charm the cows. These fragments of story, stripped of their full horror, became local folklore, folded into the fabric of place. The pain of the trials was not necessarily denied, but it was often set aside, buried beneath layers of myth and retelling. And then there is the cultural image of the witcher figure who, over time, took on new meanings. In literature, she became a villain, a warning. In fairy tales, she lured children and lived in twisted woods. In theatre, she appeared as the source of storms and omens. The fearful realities of past centuries were distilled into symbols, often theatrical, sometimes comical, and occasionally reclaimed. But beneath the evolving image lies something more persistent, the archetype of the outsider, the one who speaks when silence is expected, the one who knows too much, or too little, or simply stands apart. The witch, in many ways, became a vessel for all that society once feared in itself. In recent decades, some communities have begun to quietly honor those who were once condemned. Small memorials have appeared, modest plaques, stones carved with names once erased. In parts of Scotland, Germany, and Norway, towns have installed markers to remember those tried and executed. These gestures are quiet, even humble, but they represent a growing willingness to look back, not with blame, but with recognition. Scholars, and writers too, have worked to reclaim the stories. Through patient work in archives and oral histories, they have recovered the names and lives of many who were lost. Not all, of course. Many stories will remain untold, but each rediscovered life becomes a small thread, rewoven into the historical fabric, reminders that these were real people, not just shadows in a tale. And there is something else, something more subtle, that remains, a caution, a quiet warning carried across the centuries about what fear can do when paired with power and suspicion, about how fragile justice becomes when shaped by emotion rather than reason. The witch trials were never only about witchcraft. They were about control and conformity, and what happens when communities turn inward, toward fear instead of understanding. And while those exact patterns may no longer repeat, the impulsito find blame in the different. To seek simple answers to complex problems still lingers. In this way, the history of witch trials is not just a relic of the past. It is a mirror that reflects not only what people once believed, but what people are still capable of believing when the world feels uncertain. And yet, knowing this does not need to unsettle you. It can, instead, offer a kind of peace. For in studying the past so carefully, in tracing each line and echo, you bring light into dark corners. You name the forgotten. You recognize the mistakes. And you carry forward a memory that is gentler, wiser, and more aware. Now, in our final moments together tonight, let us step back from the particulars from courts and customs and cold stone cellsand. Let ourselves drift into a broader reflection, one that gently leads us from the world of fear and fire into the quiet warmth of the present. And now, the long path winds toward its end. You've walked softly through the shadows of history, among quiet voices and forgotten faces. You've seen how fear can take shape, how suspicion can grow legs and teeth, how silence and difference once innocent can become dangerous in the eyes of others. But now, as you lie still and let the images fade, let the past settle like dust in a closed book, you can take comfort in the gentle distance that time brings. You are not in a village of mud and stone, watching smoke rise above a silent crowd. You are not being watched from behind shuttered windows. No inquisitor waits with parchment and ink. No testimony will be twisted from you. That world, with its harsh judgments and fearful certainties, is far away. The air around you is still. Your room is quiet. You know your name, and no one will take it from you. There are no candles guttering low with threat, no footsteps pacing above a prison floor, just the calm certainty of the present moment, a time shaped, yes, by history, but softened by reflection and understanding. The story of the witch trials is not meant to frighten you. It is not a tale of monsters, but of people. People afraid of change, of illness, of misfortune, just as others sought comfort, wisdom, and healing. It is a story of what happens when fear outweighs compassion, and also a story of how even the deepest fear can fade, how minds can change, and how societies can grow. So let it rest now. Let the past remain behind glass, quiet and undisturbed. You have learned what you came to learn, and now you are free to close your eyes, to loosen your grip on thought, to drift gently towards sleep. Perhaps in your dreams, you'll walk through a village again, but this time, the windows are open, the hearths are warm, no one is afraid. The old healer in the woods is just a healer. The midwife is welcomed. The widow is not feared, only offered bread. And the air clear, cool and quiet carries no scent of fire. Good night.